James is 31 years old. He wakes up every morning at 6:45, makes himself a coffee, sits in traffic for 40 minutes, and spends the next 8 hours doing a job he feels neutral about. He's not miserable, he's not thriving, he's just moving through life on autopilot. And financially, James looks completely normal. He's got a salary, he's got a phone plan, he's got a Netflix subscription, and a gym membership he uses maybe twice a month. But here's the part that would make most people deeply uncomfortable if they actually stopped to look at it. James has less than $400 in his savings account. He carries just over $6,000 in credit card debt. He has contributed nothing, not a single dollar, to any kind of retirement account, and he's 31 years old. Now here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. James is not the exception. James is the average. And when you start pulling back the curtain on what the average person's financial life actually looks like, the real numbers, not the curated Instagram version, what you find is a picture so far from what most people imagine that it's almost hard to believe. Because we live in a world that is constantly selling us the image of prosperity. New cars on every street, packed restaurants on a Tuesday night, booked holiday flights. Everyone around you seems to be doing fine. But the data tells a completely different story. And today, we're going to walk through that data stat by stat and figure out not just what's happening, but why. Because the numbers alone aren't the real story. The real story is the psychology underneath them, the invisible forces that make perfectly intelligent people like James end up exactly where he is without ever meaning to get there. Let's start with the stat that stopped me cold the first time I read it. Nearly 6 in 10 adults in the United States could not cover an unexpected expense of $1,000 from their savings. Not $3,000, not $5,000, $1,000. A single car repair, a single trip to urgent care, $1,000, and the majority of people are one surprise away from having to borrow money or go into debt just to deal with it. Think about what that actually means for James. James earns a decent salary. He's been working for 9 years, and yet if his transmission blew out tomorrow morning on the way to work, he would have to put it on a credit card, or call his parents, or take out a personal loan. The money simply isn't sitting there. And here's where the psychology gets really interesting. James knows this. He's not oblivious. Ask him if he should have more savings, and he'll tell you yes, absolutely, 100%. But knowing something and doing something are two very different cognitive experiences. Psychologists call this the intention-action gap, the maddening space between what we plan to do and what we actually do. And money is one of the most fertile grounds for this gap to exist because spending feels immediate and real, while saving feels abstract and distant. When James gets his paycheck, the rent is due now. The electricity bill is due now. The minimum payment on his credit card is due now. But his future self, the 65-year-old version of James who might really need that money, feels like a stranger, someone he vaguely knows he should care about, but who doesn't seem quite real enough to sacrifice for today. That gap between today's James and future James is costing him enormously, and he doesn't even feel it happening. Now let's talk about debt, because this is where the numbers go from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming. The average American household carries over $10,000 in credit card debt alone. Not mortgage debt, not student loans, credit card debt, the kind that compounds at interest rates hovering around 22% annually. Let that number breathe for a second. 22%. For context, the stock market in a good year returns somewhere between 8 and 10% on average. The greatest investors in history have sustained returns of around 20% over long periods. Warren Buffett built one of the greatest wealth creation machines in human history, averaging around 20% annually. And the average person is sitting with debt growing at 22%, guaranteed, every single month. James has $6,000 on his card. At 22% interest, making only minimum payments, James will spend years paying that debt down, and somewhere around $3,000 of what he pays will go purely to interest, not to the actual debt, just to the cost of having carried the debt. $3,000 that evaporates into thin air, that James worked real hours to earn, just gone. But here's what makes this psychologically fascinating rather than just frustrating. Credit cards were designed, meticulously, intentionally designed, to feel painless in the moment. There's research showing that paying with a physical card, as opposed to cash, reduces the emotional sting of spending by a measurable amount. Your brain processes the loss of cash as a real loss. It processes a card swipe as something far more abstract. And digital payments, even more removed. The further money gets from something physical and tangible, the less our brains register the cost. So James doesn't feel like he's making bad decisions. Each individual purchase felt completely reasonable. A dinner here, a flight there, a few months of buying slightly nicer things than he strictly needed. None of it felt reckless, but the balance grew quietly in the background, the way a slow leak in a roof goes unnoticed until the ceiling caves in. Here's a stat that tends to hit people differently depending on their age. The median retirement savings for Americans between the ages of 35 and 44, people who have been working for over a decade, is just $45,000. And for the group between 45 and 54, it barely crosses $100,000. Now, those numbers might sound okay on the surface, but run the math on what someone actually needs to retire without dramatically downgrading their lifestyle, and the picture shifts fast. Most financial planners point to a target of roughly 25 times your annual expenses saved at retirement. If James wants to live on $50,000 a year in retirement, he needs to have accumulated $1.25 million. $1.25 million, and the median 40-year-old has $45,000. James is 31. He has zero. But here's the twist in the story, and this is the part that matters more than any of the alarming statistics. James still has time. Not unlimited time, not comfortable, leisurely time where he can keep putting it off indefinitely, but real, meaningful, compounding time. Because the engine that makes retirement savings actually work is compounding. And compounding is one of those concepts that everyone has heard about, but almost nobody truly feels in their gut until you see the numbers laid out side by side. If James starts investing $500 a month today at 31, and earns a modest 7% annual return, he will have approximately $1.3 million by the time he's 65. 34 years of consistent, boring, automatic investing. But if James waits just 10 years, if he starts at 41 instead of 31, that same $500 a month at the same return lands him at around $620,000, less than half. Same monthly amount, same return. 10 years later, almost $700,000 less. That is the cost of delay. That is what procrastination actually looks like in financial terms. Not a mistake you can feel today, but a consequence you cannot escape later. Let's come back to James for a moment, because something important is happening that the stats alone don't capture. James is not lazy. James is not irresponsible in any obvious way. James works hard. He pays his bills. He tips at restaurants. By any social measure, James is a perfectly reasonable adult navigating life responsibly. So why is he in this position? Part of it is the environment. James grew up watching his parents manage money mostly by feel, spending what came in, saving what was left over, which was usually nothing. Nobody sat him down at 18 and explained compound interest. Nobody showed him what a Roth IRA was. Nobody walked him through the terrifying math of credit card interest. These things simply weren't part of the conversation. And so James entered adulthood financially blind, not stupid, just uninformed in a world that moves fast and sells hard. Here's a stat that ties this together in a painful way. Studies consistently show that financial literacy levels in adults remain remarkably low across income groups. The majority of adults cannot correctly answer basic questions about compound interest, inflation, or investment risk. People who make $100,000 a year get these questions wrong almost as often as people who make $30,000. Income does not automatically produce financial knowledge, and financial knowledge does not automatically produce financial behavior. There are three completely separate layers here: knowing, understanding, and doing, and most people are missing at least two of them, which is exactly why the average person ends up looking like James. Not because they chose this, but because nobody ever showed them a different way to move through the world. There's one more statistic that I think is the most psychologically loaded of all the ones we've looked at today. The average American spends significantly more per year on lottery tickets than on retirement contributions if they have no employer plan in place. Billions of dollars flow into lotteries annually from people who have virtually nothing saved. And when you ask people why they play, the answer is almost always the same: because it's the only plan I've got. That sentence deserves a moment of silence. Because it's the only plan I've got. That is what financial despair actually sounds like when it speaks quietly. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet, resigned belief that the normal rules of wealth building don't apply to you. That the only realistic path from where you are to somewhere better is a miracle. And the tragedy isn't that people play the lottery. The tragedy is that they've been left alone long enough with their financial situation to genuinely believe that a 1 in 300 million chance is their most viable option. So where does this leave James? Where does this leave anyone who recognizes a bit of themselves in his story? The honest answer, the one that isn't wrapped in false comfort but also isn't drowning in doom, is this: the stats are bad, the averages are sobering, but averages are made up of individual people, and individual people can make different choices than the group. The average is not a destiny, it is a description of what happens when people don't have a plan, and James can have a plan starting today. Not a complicated plan, not a plan that requires a financial advisor or a huge income or perfect circumstances. The kind of plan that starts with one decision: build a buffer. Even $500 sitting in a separate account changes the psychological experience of money in a way that's hard to explain until you feel it. It stops you from panic borrowing at the worst moments. It creates just enough breathing room to think clearly. Then look at the debt. Not all debt is equal, but the high-interest kind is quietly the most destructive force in James's financial life right now. Every month that debt sits there, it grows. Every month James waits, it costs him more than almost any investment he could make in the opposite direction. And then, before anything else, before he picks a single stock or downloads a single investing app, he finds out whether his employer matches retirement contributions. Because if they do, and James isn't taking it, he's leaving guaranteed money uncollected every single payday. That's not an investing question, that's a math question, and the math is not subtle. These aren't exciting steps. Nobody makes a viral YouTube video about building a $500 emergency buffer, but these are the steps that separate people who gradually, quietly build wealth from people who spend their entire lives feeling like they're running in place. The shocking money stats of the average person are shocking not because the numbers are dramatic. They're shocking because of how unnecessary they are. James is not doomed by his income. He's not trapped by his circumstances. He's been moving through life without a map, in a journey that has very real directions, directions that aren't hidden, aren't complicated, and don't require perfection. The most expensive financial mistake James ever made wasn't a bad investment or a reckless purchase. It was the years he spent assuming that figuring this stuff out was something he'd get around to eventually. Eventually has a cost, and that cost compounds daily, just like everything else in the world of money. The good news is that so does the decision to start.